Ridley Scott's Napoleon, a disaster and disgrace to film and history, and a missed opportunity. The 2002 Ridley Scott Napoleon is one of the worst movies I have ever seen, both a shameful excuse for cinema and an insulting abuse to history. Dozens of reviews have come out on YouTube in the past weeks, the vast majority of them rightly negative, but my review will be more thorough than most of them, going scene by scene, dissecting how it failed to do practically anything right and managed to do a whole lot wrong. In this essay, I will focus on two main elements: the storytelling, including the wooden, unimaginative dialogue, uninteresting cinematography, and the poorly attempted romance, and the history, with an emphasis on the battles, which most people will at first believe was one of the few redeeming parts of the film. In doing so, I will occasionally compare Scott's disaster piece to three other previous pieces of media about Napoleon: the 1970 Waterloo, the 2002 French miniseries Napoleon, and the 1969 Stanley Kubrick script that he never got to film, but was in fact used by Scott. Let's begin with that Kubrick script. Credit for the Napoleon script going to David Scarpa is simply shameful dishonesty, practically plagiarism. Anyone who has read Stanley Kubrick's Napoleon script, and it is available free online, link in the description, can clearly see that Ridley Scott's movie used it as its skeletal outline, in some places using exact lines, word for word from it. Stanley Kubrick made a car he never got to drive, while Ridley Scott crashed a car he didn't make. Every change he made was a mistake, and I expect Scott made Kubrick, as well as Napoleon, roll over in his grave. Ridley Scott was simply not the person to make this film, because he demonstrated in every possible way that he was not interested in Napoleon in the first place. He took one of the most important, famous, interesting, complex figures in human history and made him out to be a dull, clumsy, petty, pathetic, charismatic, weak, and unintelligent, in a blatant case of character assassination. Who was his target audience? Those who wanted the battles will be disappointed. Those who wanted the romance will be disappointed. Those who know the history will be insulted, and those who don't will simply be bored and uncomfortable and misled into thinking they are learning history. I have many complaints about things being cut that some may defend the movie by saying things had to inevitably be cut. But we have many examples of massive films being hits. Lawrence of Arabia, Ben-Hur, and Apocalypse Now were all 3.5 hours. Schindler's List, Titanic, and Avengers Endgame were each 3 hours. So not only could Ridley Scott's Napoleon have easily been a half hour longer, but as you'll see, Scott simply uses the 2.5 hours he does have very poorly. A couple more thoughts before we dive into the scenes themselves. Scott clumsily inserted several African men throughout his film set in 1700s and 1800s France, which accomplishes nothing but breaking realism. But the one black man who certainly did belong in the film was lamentably overlooked. While the black general in Napoleon's staff might at first appear absurd, he is credited as General Thomas Alexandre Dumas, the father of Alexandre Dumas, author of Three Musketeers and Count of Monte Cristo. He had in fact been born a slave in Haiti. Now, this would have been an interesting relationship to pursue, considering that Napoleon brought back slavery to the French Empire in 1802, after the Republic had abolished it in 1794, under Maximilien Robespierre. Further, General Dumas and Napoleon fought together in Italy and Egypt, and were actually something of rivals, frequently verbally clashing with each other. Now, that would have been interesting to see. Showing the one black general in Napoleon's staff, but not giving him any dialogue or action, any attention at all, is not respectful to him or to his race. Rather, it reduces General Dumas to contemporary, political, partisan eye candy. Final preliminary thought is that I should mention the bluish, hazy, muted tint lens used throughout the entire film. There is nothing bright or colorful in the entire thing, as if subliminally telling us that we should be bored. When I watched the movie, I thought the one good thing it did have was the costume design. But when I look at clips of the 2002 Napoleon or 1970 Waterloo again, I am reminded that their costumes were just as good and so this is not an impressive accomplishment. After a couple introductory scenes, most notably the execution of Marie Antoinette, the first real interesting scene we get is the assault on Fort Leguelette, really Fort Mulgrave, in Toulon, which was one of the best in the entire movie, but it was still sorely wanting. The French Republican Army is besieging and attempting to take Toulon, an important harbor on the Mediterranean coast held by the British. Actually, there were more Spanish and Italian troops defending Toulon than British soldiers, but Scott completely ignores both Spain and Italy in the entire movie. Anyway, after 3 months of the French failing to make any progress in the siege, Napoleon, an upcoming captain 24 years young, proposed that they should concentrate their efforts on taking the fort across the bay, and don't need to continue wasting resources on trying to take the whole town. In Scott's film, Napoleon, no offense to Joaquin Phoenix as an actor, but he looks as old as his 49 years throughout the movie. The Napoleon acts as a sneaky spy, slipping into the city to scout it out himself, disguised as a random peasant, choosing cool over the least shred of reality. Napoleon's genius, in part, laying in being able to synthesize information that is brought to him. This scene should have taken place in a tent over a map, as Stanley Kubrick had intended it. And don't think that would have been boring. 12 Angry Men was set 90% in one room around a table, and it was still dramatic. Anyway, as for the attack itself, it was pretty cool and mostly fine. I really liked showing the horse killed out from under him, and I loved him taking the cannonball out of its corpse after the battle as a souvenir for Mother, because that's a tasteful nod to his love for his mother. And I was okay with how nervous he was, considering it was his first battle in command. But why does Scott have sappers blow up a portion of the defender's wall and show some soldiers rushing in, but then ignores or forgets it and focuses exclusively on the soldiers who went over the walls with ladders? Also, Napoleon was wounded with a bayonet to his leg during this fighting, as he did in fact lead the second wave in person, and Kubrick shows this in his script. So why did Scott leave that wound out? Did he not want to give Napoleon that honor? By the way, 2 extra facts about this battle to remind you that history is more awesome than fiction. First, when no French soldiers wanted to serve in Napoleon's forward artillery battery because it was so dangerous from being so exposed to British fire, he changed its name to Les Hommes Sans Peur, that is, the men without fear, after which he had no trouble getting men to fill his ranks. Second, Fort Mulgrave was defended by General Charles O'Hara, who had surrendered along with Cornwallis to General George Washington in 1781 at Yorktown a decade earlier, making him the only man to be defeated by both George Washington and Napoleon Bonaparte. Back to the film, there is a problem with the following scene in which Napoleon is promoted to Brigadier General. Just like in Kubrick's script, Paul Barras gives him his promotion, and there is no dialogue in Kubrick's version, so I think it's fine that Scott fleshed it out, except that Napoleon looked utterly bored and uninterested. But dang, what was with that circular formation? It looked so CGI fake, which perhaps the bad lighting was trying to hide. There is no real formation like that. If Scott had wanted to make it actually feel real, he would have had the soldiers just stand in rows, but he thought his vision looked cooler than reality. It doesn't, by the way. It looks dumb. The film is sorely lacking in any memorable dialogue, except for the absurd, awkward, goofy lines like, "You English think you're so great because you have boats?" Some quick online research reveals that before the assault on Fort Leguelette, or Mulgrave, one general declared, "There is only one possible plan, Bonaparte's." And after the battle, another general remarked that, "I have no words to describe Bonaparte's merit. Much tactical skill, an equal degree of intelligence, and too much gallantry." Now dang, there's some cool lines that could have been used. Moving on, Napoleon is awkward in Kubrick's version of the party at which he meets Josephine de Beauharnais as well, and I agree this is fine. Napoleon is a military man from a fairly poor background, so it is plausible and faithful to his character of the real man that he might be uncomfortable and out of place in this high society context. So what is the problem? Here's the whole dialogue for Scott's scene. Napoleon stares at Josephine, who is playing cards at a table across the room. She sees him and walks over to him. "Why are you staring at me?" she says. "Am I? I was not." "Oh, you weren't." I was staring at your face." "What is this costume you have on?" "This is my uniform. I led the French victory at Toulon." She looks away, then looks back and opens her mouth, but Napoleon interrupts her. "Do not tell me your name." And she walks away again. No smiles, no touch, no warmth, no nothing. Some people try to say that Joaquin Phoenix and Vanessa Kirby did a good job acting, but in this scene and the entire movie, they demonstrated not an ounce of charisma, both of them feeling stale, emotionless, lifeless. The camera also lazily uses only the reverse shot in the scene, never showing the two in the same frame. The real Napoleon was a charismatic tomcat, yet here, in the entire movie in fact, he's just an awkward and creepy incel. Oh, and there's an African aristocrat in this social dance, in case you forgot you were watching a movie made in 2023. Moving on, the infamous whiff of grape shot incident of the 13th Vendémiaire, that is the 5th October 1795, is another important step of Napoleon's rise to power. In Kubrick's vision, citizen Paul Barras is nervous and anxious, considering and prepared to flee into exile, begging Napoleon for insight as to how they can salvage the situation and save the revolution from the impending royalist counter-rebellion. Napoleon accepts being second in command, even cracks a joke in the face of death, and puts his arm around Barras, confidently assuring him that, quote, "everything will be all right." Meanwhile, Scott has Napoleon demand first in command, with his usual dour, sour manner. The 2002 4-episode miniseries shows Napoleon using a map, a handy visual we only get once in Scott's movie, and gives him the charismatic line, quote, "If I draw my sword, it will remain drawn until the order of the Republic is restored." Now that's hardcore. That's a man with balls of steel, patriotism manifested in violence. That was Napoleon. The miniseries gives the scene about 5 minutes, twice as long as Scott's equivalent scene, and shows that the rioters were armed with muskets and killed a few French soldiers, not being unarmed and harmless. It seems to me that Scott was inspired more by recent American political drama than by 18th century French political drama. The next scene for both Kubrick and Scott has the 14-year-old son of Josephine, Eugene, visit General Napoleon to ask for the sword of his father, who had recently been executed by the revolution, to be returned to his family as an heirloom. In Kubrick's vision, Napoleon begins the scene crawling on the floor, pencil in his teeth, examining a map of Italy with 4 of his generals, preparing for their important Italian campaign, which is completely skipped over in Scott's movie. A clever moment of humor is provided when he and one of his generals bump heads, providing the audience with an honest chuckle without degrading Napoleon. In Scott's version, Napoleon and one of his generals are playing a game of throwing small objects at some target. It's not darts, and it's not clear what they're throwing or what the target is. They look more like frat boys the morning after a party than intelligent, industrious, revolutionary generals. And they aren't even laughing or joking, they just look bored. In Kubrick's vision, the generals refused Eugene because they were busy, but Napoleon allowed him entry precisely because he recognizes his name, Baronnet, as belonging to Josephine, that woman who recently intrigued him. Throughout their conversation, Napoleon continues to study the map of Italy, which feels more natural than Napoleon just sitting in a chair behind a desk, which simply lacks imagination. Kubrick has it that when Eugene's father's sword was confiscated, the officer involved gave Eugene a receipt that it might be kept track of, while Scott had Napoleon simply take one sword at random from a collection of hundreds of swords that had been confiscated, which is so frustrating and unsatisfying by comparison. Then, when Napoleon shows up at Josephine's house, Kubrick gives them more warmth and chemistry in that one conversation that Scott gives their whole relationship in the entire movie. The best meeting scene, however, is in the 2002 French miniseries. Kubrick and Scott both then jump right to their weddings and a sex scene between Napoleon and Josephine. The way that Scott's Josephine proposes this is shown in the trailer. They sit alone in an empty room, stiff and awkward, and she opens her legs and slowly hikes up her skirt and says the atrocious line, "If you look down, you will see a surprise, and once you see it, you will always want it." And then he slowly looks down, and that's it. Aside from this insulting the real person of Josephine and reducing her memory to that of a slut, it's just shoddy and stupid writing, even if it is intended as fiction. And let me tell you, the sex scenes that Scott gives us are the least romantic sex scenes you could imagine. They both, there may have been more in the extended full 4-hour version, consist of simply Napoleon forcefully entering her from behind, both standing, both still fully clothed. He looks more like a dog and she a bitch than two passionate lovers. No caressing, hardly any kissing. If this is how Scott views sex, I pity his wife. And no, I don't feel bad making ad hominems against Scott. I'm just showing him the same courtesy he shows Napoleon. And then, as Napoleon rebuttons his trousers, he remarks something like, "Let that put an air in you," as if that's what would have been on his mind. He shouldn't have been anxious about producing an heir until much later on, at least after he was crowned emperor. Scott tries to show Napoleon as hopelessly in love with Josephine, as indeed his collection of letters in the public domain show, and Kubrick's script has too, yet he has him callously say after making love with her, essentially, "I sure hope you're pregnant now." All Napoleon and Josephine's interactions are equally uncomfortable, and make Anakin Skywalker's complaint to Padme about sand sound like a Shakespearean sonnet in comparison. The purpose of these scenes is clear. It is simply meant to make us, both men and women in the audience, feel repulsed by Napoleon. Meanwhile, 2002's Napoleon, making his wife smile and laugh in bed. "Tonight I have a woman to love, and tomorrow I must take Italy back from Austria." Kubrick then next treats us to 4.5 pages of Napoleon's invasion of Italy, which is completely skipped over in Scott's. Again, I understand that some things need to be cut for time, but every minute Scott chose to give to Josephine is one less minute given to Napoleon's battles and politics, which would show the genius that made the man a legend in the first place. I also know that Italy was not shown even in Scott's full 4-hour version because he stupidly has Napoleon state in one of his voice-over letters that his army, quote, "took Italy without conflict," which is insulting and absurd because Italy was the site of Napoleon's first great campaign, lasting longer than 3 years. Moving over to Egypt, even Scott's mummy scene is in Kubrick's original. Scott just intentionally makes it awkward, while Kubrick states that, quote, "a mood of somber reflection pervades the scene." I hope, but doubt, that Scott's 4-hour version gives more credit to what Napoleon's archaeologists accomplished in Egypt, including finding the Rosetta Stone and beginning plans for the Suez Canal. Kubrick includes the humorous touch of having a drummer boy scribble "Vive la République" on one of the tomb walls. Scott just gives us big shots of sand and ruins. The sequence of voiceovers of excerpts of Napoleon's letters to Josephine over visuals of Egypt and Josephine's affair with Hippolyte Charles, that was also taken directly from Kubrick's script. Scott's version of the Battle of the Pyramids is as dull and boring as everything else. And if there is more in his full version, he picked the wrong 2 minutes to show in the theater version. Indeed, the 2 minutes he used should never have been filmed at all. A line of Turkish Arab Mamluk soldiers faces off against a mass of French soldiers. Napoleon has his cannons fire at the top of the pyramids behind his foe, causing a cascade of ancient stone and a shock that throws the Mamluk commander off his horse. That's it. Kubrick, on the other hand, puts us in the middle of a French infantry square, surrounded by screaming, circling Mamluk cavalry being picked off by the steady fire of French muskets. Napoleon displays his famous charisma by saying, shouting above the din of battle, to a small party of frightened archaeologists, "Good afternoon, gentlemen. I hope you are enjoying this unusual spectacle. One cannot see this in Paris for any price." Simple, impressive, historically accurate, witty, and effortlessly foreshadows Napoleon's last battle at Waterloo, in which it is his cavalry who circle to no avail squares of British infantry. The 2002 miniseries, meanwhile, does not show any battle in Egypt, but has Napoleon respectfully say, "Gentlemen, the pyramids, 4,000 years of history are contemplating us," and gives him a conversation with one of the archaeologists whom he brought, showing that he was a man who appreciated culture and respected history. He read the French translation of the Quran, which Scott does not begin to show. The 2002 series also gives us a scene of him rallying the morale of his epidemic-struck men. Even if Scott filmed something like this for his full version, I doubt anyone would honestly find Joaquin Phoenix's presentation very inspiring. And I don't think I'm asking for too much, even considering the time restraints. The miniseries only gave Egypt 8 minutes. It just used them well. The way Scott reveals Josephine's affair with Hippolyte Charles to Napoleon is utterly without imagination, and feels as stiff as the rest of the movie. He simply has Major Jean Andoche Junot tell him while they are eating a meal in the camp. Napoleon doesn't believe him and dismisses him, petitly remarking, "No dessert for you," but then pursues him and asks how he knows, and believes him, at which point he packs up to return to France. Kubrick builds it up a bit more by first having Napoleon receive an unsigned letter warning him of the affair, and he asks his cabinet if they know anything about this, which they deny, not wanting to cause him pain. A couple scenes later, we see Napoleon at his desk, hard at work at a pile of papers, showing the drive and intelligence which Scott never shows. Major Junot reveals Josephine's affair only because his lips are loosened by alcohol from a bordello, and Napoleon squeezes and shakes the truth out of him. This feels much more creative and natural than the cardboard statement of fact which Scott gives us. Then, when Napoleon returns to France, his interview with the Directory is simply immature. The parts that are decent are taken word for word from the Kubrick script. He literally interrupts them by lifting a finger and saying, "Shh." No tact, no charisma, no fire in his eyes, and his voice ever a monotone. Then when he returns to his house and asks his maid where Josephine is, he loses his temper and throws his glass of wine on her. Similarly, when Napoleon and Josephine meet, Napoleon yells at her like a toddler's temper tantrum, with intentionally petty dialogue. "How could you care so little for me and my feelings? I want you to say I am the most important thing in the world." Kubrick, on the other hand, again gives us a touch of humor by juxtaposition amidst the tension. Napoleon says to his brother, "My dear Joseph, the only thing that is clear is that my wife is a slut. And while a man may want a slut for his mistress, he does not want her for his wife." Then the very next scene is he and Josephine having sex. Scott took much of the dialogue for their post-coital conversation directly from Kubrick, but just made it not as good. Kubrick describes Josephine's mood as one of, quote, submission and apprehension, hanging on Napoleon to take her back. But Scott has her get the upper hand and makes Napoleon say, nay, whimper, that he is, quote, nothing without her. Now, in one of his letters from Italy, Napoleon really did write to her that he was nothing without her. But in the way Scott uses this line, it was distasteful, not romantic. Moving on, the scene of the coup d'etat of 18th Brumaire is similarly taken almost directly from Kubrick's script. The arrests of the 5 members of the Directory, the charismatic defiant speech given by Pierre Delbrel against the coup, and Lucien Bonaparte trying desperately to call order. By the way, Scott takes an opportunity in the arrest scenes to make another joke in poor taste. Following the arrest of one of the directors, the police captain, a black man for contemporary virtue signaling rather than historical realism, Scott has the director's wife simply crying pathetically and flailing her arms. This induces no pity, no empathy, only ridicule. Again, if it was trying to be a joke, it was just awkward, not funny. Anyway, in the other room, Kubrick has Emmanuel Joseph Sieyès antsy and nervous, ready to take the carriage and flee, while Napoleon urges him to have patience, all will be well, as steady as he was when putting down the royalist rebellion. Both Kubrick and Scott show Napoleon enter the council room, be beaten by the furious councilman, and flee for his life, as did happen in history. But the mood is completely different. Scott has his brother Lucien give a rousing speech to the French grenadiers waiting outside, and Napoleon is just the figurehead of the coup, while Kubrick has Napoleon rousing his men to his side by showing his bloody face to them. Scott flips the roles, having the other members of the coup be more level-headed and Napoleon more frightened, for no other foreseeable purpose than to suck the glory out of Napoleon and give it to those around him. Admittedly, the coup was certainly a group project which Napoleon could not have accomplished on his own. But still, the thesis for Scott's film at this point is clear. Napoleon was not so great after all. I cannot fairly fault Scott for jumping from the 1799 coup to Napoleon's 1804 coronation as emperor, because Kubrick intended to do the same, though this sadly skips over the entire war of the Second Coalition. My only complaint is that it could have used more Latin, being a full mass, not just a 3-minute ceremony. Though this is nitpicky, I can't ask a secular director to care about religion if he doesn't care about historical accuracy in the first place. And it might look a little grander than the 2002 miniseries, but the 2002 coronation feels more valuable because it is built up to, preceded by a conversation between Napoleon and Josephine and between Napoleon and Pope Pius VII, explaining how significant it was that Napoleon got the Pope to come to Paris because he restored the Catholic faith to France, while Scott's coronation scene kind of just stands alone. Also, the real Josephine was 6 years older than Napoleon, while Joaquin Phoenix is 14 years older than Vanessa Kirby. The next scene for Kubrick shows Napoleon and Josephine at a banquet dinner with members of French high society. Kubrick gives Napoleon dialogue of political science, criticizing the flawed philosophy of the revolution as overly ideal and utopian, while being witty enough to earn laughter from his guests who hang on every word. Scott and Phoenix's Napoleon was never shown expressing political intelligence or wit, nor would that have been consistent with the cardboard incel school shooter persona they gave him, which is how I know they didn't give him the equivalent eloquent scenes in his full 4-hour cut. Then, Napoleon cleverly gets a strikingly beautiful, sexy brunette, in Kubrick's own words, away from the table by having a servant accidentally spill wine on her, then follows her to help her clean up, which quickly turns to him seducing and having sex with her. This was part of the dark side of Napoleon that Scott could have shown, his shameless infidelity. And then, what is heartbreaking, Josephine follows them, agitated, because she has, quote, seen the routine before. Through a closed door, she begs him to come back to dinner, while he denies what he is doing, insisting that he is working, and orders her to go back to dinner and that he will be back in 5 minutes. This scene alone would have made Josephine more sympathetic, and Napoleon more the scoundrel that he was, than they appear in all of Scott's desecration. Scott, on the contrary, has an imbecile scene in which Napoleon's mother, Letizia, proposes to him an experiment to see if he is fertile, as he and Josephine have failed to have a child in over 8 years of marriage, by hooking him up with a young woman to see if he can impregnate her. Not a bad idea, given the context. The stupid part is that Napoleon in reality needed no more encouragement to conquer in bed than he needed to conquer in battle, having at least 9 mistresses and fathering at least 5 bastards, while Scott has him act all bashful, asking his mother for, quote, another drink, to steal his nerves before he enters the bedchambers, where he just awkwardly looks at the young woman before blowing out the candles. End scene. Did Scott forget that he earlier had Napoleon admit to Josephine that he had slept with many women while away in Egypt? Scott can't even be consistent with his own portrayal of Napoleon, let alone with history. Kubrick's next scene presents a tender moment in bed, in which Napoleon and Josephine apologize to each other, and which alone also has more chemistry than all of Scott's version. Josephine shares that the physician she is seeing is going to have her visit a place with some springs that may help her get pregnant. Quote, apparently he sent Madame Lefloche there last year, and she gave birth to twins. Napoleon laughs weakly. Indeed. Well, you may tell Dr. Carvissar I should be entirely satisfied with half her success. Simple, organic, witty. Scott took this same outline and butchered it. Napoleon comes upon Josephine at breakfast, roughly demands why she isn't pregnant yet. She says that bit about the doctor taking her to the springs, and Napoleon repeats his demand why she isn't pregnant yet, then proceeds to pull her out of her chair and have sex with her right under the table, right in front of a few servants. Scott takes every possible opportunity to show Napoleon as an uncharismatic, immature brute. Moving on to the 1805 Battle of Austerlitz, Kubrick did not write any details of the battle in his script, so I will keep my remarks to reviewing Scott's. Many people say that this was their favorite part of the movie, and, frankly, most of it was shown in the trailers. The majority of what was cool about the scene was, of course, when Napoleon shatters the frozen lake with his cannons, sinking the Russian army almost entirely into a watery grave, which is about as true as if a depiction of D-Day showed the entire Anglo-American army invading by glider and parachute because the director thought that part was cooler than the beaches. The Battle of Austerlitz was 7 miles wide, had over 70,000 men fighting in each army, and lasted about 8 hours. Scott's movie makes the battlefield to be about the size of one football field, with maybe 10,000 on each side, and makes the entire combat about 5 minutes. No, that wasn't a time constraint, that was a decision, because Scott took the minutes that belonged to Austerlitz and gave them to Josephine and Napoleon's so-called romance. And again, the 2002 miniseries manages to show the Battle of Austerlitz in 8 minutes too, not only telling the truth, but also simply showing a battle that makes more sense. 2002's Napoleon says, while looking at his marching foes through a telescope, "It always looks so beautiful at the beginning." That one line is more Napoleon than Scott shows in 2.5 hours. Indeed, the 2002 miniseries Battle of Austerlitz even looks better because they used real actors and a real battlefield. Frankly, the 1956 War and Peace also did it better in less time. Scott's version might seem cooler to some, but to those who know, it looks fake because it is. First, in the real battle, the cover of fog did play a crucial role in the beginning, but Scott would have you believe the entire battle took place at night from how dark the lighting is. Further, it has Napoleon again acting as a forward scout, riding a mule all alone, disguised as a peasant so he can personally see the enemy army approach. Did Scott not know that light cavalry existed for this purpose, or was he perhaps just obsessed with Assassin's Creed? Scott has the bait part of the French army defending a camp, which is not what happened. Upon close inspection anyway, the French camp even looks absurd. A count on a paused screen shows at least 40 French flags, practically one for every other tent, and not a single regimental flag. It looks like Scott built a camp of 4 tents, and then just CGI copied and pasted them to make a whole camp. Anyway, as the Russian army approaches, Scott's Napoleon says, "Wait, let them think they have the higher ground." In the real Austerlitz, tricking the Austro-Russian allies into giving up their higher ground, the Pratzen Heights, was part of Napoleon's brilliant plan. But in Scott's scene, there is no high ground. Just look at the battle, and you clearly see that Napoleon's line doesn't correspond with what you see, because the Allies and French are both fighting on an open plain. A frozen lake, in fact. According to legend, when the Allies did give up their high ground, Napoleon remarked, "Never interrupt your enemy when he is making a mistake." Now, how is that for a memorable one-liner? Scott begins the battle with a frontal assault of Allied infantry and cavalry together. Not only does this show that Scott didn't study this particular battle, but that he didn't study Napoleonic warfare at all, because only an idiot would initiate a battle by committing his cavalry in a frontal charge against an infantry line, especially without artillery first softening them up, and that charging infantry and cavalry together makes equally no sense. Scott's Napoleon then commands, to no one in particular, "Send in the infantry, take their position on the higher ground." First, as I pointed out, there is no higher ground in Scott's depiction. Second, Napoleon really said, "One sharp blow and the war is over," which is so much cooler and simply another missed opportunity. And third, you can't give orders to, quote, "the infantry," but to particular units, such as Dominic Vendémiaire's division and Louis Vincent de Saint-Hilaire's division, the ones who actually carried out the attack. What follows is an absolutely disgusting melee mosh pit of a disorganized mass of people, no semblance of organization or unit cohesion. The infantry might as well be using spears rather than muskets, because there is no more than one line volley in the entire battle scene. "Cavalry from the west, pierce their flanks." That should be singular, flank. "Uncover the cannons." Why is Napoleon just shouting these commands? Who is he talking to? There should be a small cluster of officers and riders standing around him taking his orders. He just shouts his orders, and we see them immediately put into action, as if he is playing a computer game. The battle itself lasts about 50 seconds before the Allies retreat, and the retreat back across the ice is actually given more screen time than the battle itself, at about 60 seconds. Finally, in reality, the cannonballs drowning Russians in the frozen lake did happen, but was a minor part of the battle, an incidental coincidence that wasn't even part of Napoleon's plan, rather than the main part of Napoleon's plan, as Scott's movie would have you believe. Only one Russian division retreated across a frozen lake, not the entire army. The 2002 miniseries has Napoleon explain his plans to his generals, and the audience, before the battle, demonstrating his true genius. Scott waters down Napoleon's genius to the lowest common denominator. The way Scott handled Austerlitz summarizes the entire movie. He thinks he can tell a better story than the history itself, and spoiler alert, he can't and he didn't. If you want to see what a good battle scene from roughly this time period actually looks like, look up the Battle of Antietam from the movie Glory, 1989, or the infantry charge from the movie The Free State of Jones in 2016. You don't even need the context within the movies to be gripped by these scenes. They feel more real, and you care more about the deaths of the soldiers because the camera actually takes the time to show you their faces, and it makes a world of a difference. And they're all real actors, not CGI. Moving on, Kubrick also glosses over several major battles, but he does give more attention to the relationship between Napoleon and Tsar Alexander I. Indeed, their relationship was more interesting and charismatic than Scott's portrayal of Napoleon and Josephine. Kubrick wrote, quote, "Napoleon and Alexander would spend 2 weeks together, seeing each other every day and sharing the entertainments of the evening. Each would set out to charm and flatter the other, and each would succeed. They would talk of everything together as two brothers: philosophy, women, politics, war, science. Now that would have been a cool montage. And what does Scott give us instead? Napoleon and Josephine throwing food at each other across a table in front of guests, Napoleon exclaiming, 'Destiny has brought me this lamb chop.' Brilliant." Kubrick also gives us a 3-page scene of Napoleon discussing geopolitics and shifting alliances with his famous diplomat Talleyrand. I doubt Scott has that even in his secret extra hour and a half. The 2002 Napoleon gives us the elegant line at the negotiations after his victory at Austerlitz, quote, "I can demand anything? Very well, I demand peace." Scott's divorce scene is taken almost word for word from Kubrick's script, just made a little worse. After Napoleon says his lines, when Josephine breaks down crying when trying to say hers, Scott has Napoleon slap her and scold her and force her to continue, managing to make him out to be both less mature and more heartless than he truly was. The intention, again, is clear: character assassination. Kubrick's approach is subtler and more tasteful. When Josephine breaks down sobbing, Napoleon indicates to an aide to finish reading Josephine's lines for her, while she is comforted by her children. In 1810, Napoleon married his second wife, the young Austrian Duchess Marie Louise. Scott has her enter the room. Napoleon welcomes her, says she's pretty, and asks her if he looks good too, then asks if she wants to see the bedroom. End scene. Jeez. 2002's Napoleon gives their introduction no more than 3 minutes, and in that time establishes chemistry, charm, romance, wit. It reminds one what good dialogue is, and how terrible Scott's is by comparison. Kubrick gives them 4 pages, and again shows Napoleon as funny and warm, a charming romantic, treating him as the complex and intriguing human being that he was, not some caricature freak. In 2002, there's this great exchange. She says, "I was born to nobility. Do you think you can raise me even higher?" And he responds, "Yes, I can raise you to happiness." She then corrects his pronunciation of "Ich liebe dich," German for "I love you," which is such a simply adorable exchange. When Marie-Louise and Napoleon's son is born, he is taken to be shown to Josephine, and Scott takes the line, quote, "My dear, sweet child, one day perhaps you will know the sacrifices I have made for you," directly from Kubrick. But Kubrick had the imagination to set the scene as Josephine takes the 1-year-old baby on a tour of her private zoo, which Napoleon made for her, rather than just holding him on a plain front lawn. Moving on, Kubrick gives about 6 pages to setting up Napoleon's 1812 invasion of Russia. Part of this is a diplomat negotiating with Tsar Alexander, part of it is Napoleon doing research in preparation, and part is him warmly speaking to his allies about how promising the campaign is. One of the first rules of storytelling is that you need setup before payoff. Scott gives no setup, so he gives no payoff. As for the marching montage itself, Scott simply makes a bad decision in showing a Russian guerrilla ambush of marching French troops in a column. This scene should have been spent showing Russian troops burning buildings and fields in their scorched earth policy, and French military generals complaining about how difficult this is making feeding the army, which is used to being able to feed itself by foraging. In the end, more of the Grand Armée was killed by starvation than by Russian bullets, bayonets, or cannonballs. Also, that ambush scene gives us the only Russian spoken in the movie, between a couple of random Cossacks. What I would have loved to have seen was to actually use each character speaking their own language and use subtitles, as in the 1962 movie Longest Day and in the 2004 Passion of the Christ, though I recognize this is a high bar. Equally dumb is that there is one scene between some French diplomat, Talleyrand, I think, and some Austrian diplomat in which they are both speaking English until at one point the Austrian says something like, "Are you joking?" in German. What is the point of having that one line in German? Are you just trying to remind the audience that this fellow is Austrian? It doesn't increase the immersion, but rather breaks what little immersion there was. Napoleon once said, "Of all my 50 battles, the most terrible was the one I fought at Borodino." You'd never know it from watching Scott's movie. Now, Kubrick's script completely skips over the Battle of Borodino, and I agree it is fine to not give it a whole lot of attention. But if you're going to give it 1 minute, and you spend that 1 minute on Napoleon personally leading a cavalry charge, then please, for the love of all that is good and holy, put down your script and pick up a damned history book. It is neither true, nor is it really inspiring. It just looks silly. Kubrick gives 3 pages to Moscow being lit on fire. He has 2 of Napoleon's generals wake him at 4 a.m. to inform him of the bad news, the room aglow with the orange light coming in from the window. Scott does the exact same, except he takes the generals out and just has Napoleon wake up and walk outside and look at the fires in shock. There were some generals standing there outside, and they still exchanged a few lines, but they were reduced to insignificance from this small change. The freezing, starving march from Moscow back to France is similar for Kubrick and Scott, except in quality. Kubrick shows us a couple vignettes of the troops, including one soldier sadly shooting his dear horse to put it out of its misery, another soldier asking his comrade if he will share his dog with him when he decides to eat it, and a group of French soldiers being burned alive inside a shed because they lit a fire to keep warm and locked the doors to keep others out. Those stuck on the outside warm themselves on the fire that roasts their screaming comrades stuck within. Now that would have been a scene. But what does Scott give us? A bunch of cold soldiers being told by a grouchy Napoleon that they are winning the war. Yep, really immersive and inspiring. At this point, I know I sound like a broken record, but the pattern is clear. Scott takes every opportunity to deliberately try to make Napoleon look stupid. From January to March 1814, outnumbered nearly 5-1, Napoleon managed to hold off the Allied armies, inflicting defeat after defeat upon them until he was at last overwhelmed. Kubrick gave us a couple pages of this, but Scott jumps straight from Russian winter to Napoleon being exiled. Now, I know you can't show all 61 battles, and I'm not asking him for that. I'm just asking him to not imply that they didn't happen. Duke Arthur of Wellington later remarked, quote, "The study of this campaign has given me a greater idea of Napoleon's genius than any other." Scott would have you think Napoleon won battles because of ice and personally leading cavalry charge. Kubrick also gave us a heartfelt scene of Napoleon saying goodbye to his 3-year-old son and Austrian wife. I guess that would have been too much emotion for Scott's vision. Ironically, Kubrick and history gave Scott a perfect opportunity to showcase Napoleon's hubris leading directly to his downfall, but he ignored it. One of the causes of Napoleon's defeat in this campaign was that he wrote his battle plans in a letter to Marie-Louise, which was intercepted by the enemy. How classic would that have been? And you don't have to make it up. It actually happened. But no, Scott thinks he knows better than history. Also, Napoleon attempted suicide after he was defeated and before he went to Elba. That would have been an incredible scene, too. More interesting than Napoleon and Josephine having bad sex or a cringe quarrel. As for Napoleon on Elba, Scott gives us a scene that is maybe 1 minute long, consisting entirely of Napoleon drinking wine, spitting his wine back into the glass, and picking out a large fly, which he then flicks away. This may only be 1 minute, but it is 1 minute completely wasted. No, it is worse than that, because it subtly but clearly implies that Napoleon simply whiled away his time in exile. In reality, in the not quite a year that Napoleon was the emperor of the Mediterranean island, he formed an army and navy, developed the island's iron mines, oversaw the construction of new roads, issued decrees on modern agricultural methods, and overhauled the island's legal and educational system, as a quick Google search would have shown Scott. Scott constantly shows Napoleon as lazy. Remember the Hamilton musical, "You Will Never Be Satisfied," Why do you write like you're running out of time? How do you write every second you're alive? That was Napoleon's energy, and that deserved to have been treated, but Scott spat in its face. One more fun fact of history, which Kubrick includes in his vision, but that Scott took out, was that Napoleon's mother, Letizia, shared his exile on Elba. That would have been more worth spending a minute on than having Napoleon fish a fly out of his glass of wine. Scott's next abuse of history comes in having Napoleon race home to meet Josephine before she dies, only to have him arrive a few days too late. By the way, was the audience supposed to feel mournful at her death? I didn't feel anything. I didn't really care. Anyway, in reality, and in the 2002 miniseries, and in Kubrick's script, word of Josephine's death reached Napoleon on Elba a whole 9 months before he left. Now, I recognize that sometimes it is okay to change some things in history to tell the story well. Creative license. My complaint with Scott's Napoleon is that every instance of creative license he takes, and by thunder there are a lot, makes the story worse, not better. Regarding the scene in which Napoleon returns from his exile and meets the 5th Regiment who is sent to arrest him and gets them to join him instead, I need say nothing more than simply that Waterloo, the 2002 miniseries, and Kubrick's script all do the exact same scene, but better. For example, it was Marshal Michael Ney who was sent to arrest Napoleon. Napoleon invited him to rejoin him, and then it was Marshal Ney who lost Napoleon the Battle of Waterloo by leading that cavalry charge without his authorization. That's an incredible, heartbreaking irony that Scott completely misses by having Napoleon lead the Waterloo charge himself. This brings us to the climax, the Battle of Waterloo. In an interview, Ridley Scott said, quote, "I never had more than 100 horses in the field. On those big days, I would have 300 men, but what you see finally is 20,000 horses. And so that's organization, but that means everyone's blood is up near those marvelous bits you get because you've actually recreated the real thing. No, Scott, that means you haven't. Those are shamefully, laughably low numbers, and it shows. The 1970 Waterloo, by comparison, used 2,000 horses and over 17,000 men. And that also shows." The Kubrick script does not go into much detail, and of course the Waterloo movie is mostly about it, so I will here keep my commentary of the battle to what Scott's version did simply wrong. First, Napoleon was painfully ill on 18th of June, 1815, and spent much of the battle far behind the lines, even sleeping for a couple critical hours while his generals managed things. I think those who know the history will agree with me that had Napoleon been physically well, there was a decent chance he would have won at Waterloo, it being General Ney who made the blunderous cavalry charge without Napoleon's knowledge or approval, and General Emmanuel de Grouchy who failed to properly pursue Blucher's Prussians and keep them away. Duke Arthur of Wellington himself later remarked that Waterloo was close, quote, "the nearest run thing you ever saw in your life." So leaving these details out, frankly, is yet another insult to Napoleon. Second, Scott has it raining throughout the morning and stop only a few minutes before Napoleon begins the battle. This is absurd. The rain had been falling the day before the battle, turning much of the roads and field to mud, another critical factor in Napoleon's defeat, as it delayed his attack by a few hours. Scott shows a little mud, but not how it affected the battle. What he ought to have done was skip over the cause and show the effect. He showed the cause, but not the effect. Put another way, you don't have to show it raining, but you do need to show the effect the rain had on the battlefield. Otherwise, what was the point of showing the rain? Again, this was not just a historical failure, but one in basic storytelling. Third, the field itself is wrong. Scott shows simply a British and a French camp facing each other across an open field, no obstructions save a couple scattered trees, certainly no Hoguemont farm chateau on the west, or La Haisante in the center, both of which were both pivotal features of the battle. The most notable feature of Scott's Waterloo are massive trench works for both the British and the French, which simply did not exist. Looking at the French and British lines, there were just so many national flags. Pausing a bootlegged video showed me at least 16 British flags in one frame and 14 French flags in another, but no more than 1 or 2 regimental flags in the entire battle. Watch Waterloo, and you accurately see about 1 regimental flag for every national flag. Now, this might sound like a pedantic detail, but it demonstrates that, while it might look authentic and cool on the surface, a closer examination shows it to be comical and reveals that Scott didn't really consult period historians. Aside from famously telling them in an interview, "Excuse me, mate, were you there? Oh, you weren't? Well, shut the fuck up then." According to that logic, by the way, Mr. Scott, you weren't there either, so yeah. There was so much yelling orders in the battle, as if Napoleon himself just yelled directly to his men instead of going through his generals down the chain of command. This is so immature and feels like someone's imagination as to how a Napoleonic army functioned, not a glimpse into how they actually functioned. If the French artillery barrage was so effective as Scott shows, then Napoleon would not have stopped and sent in the infantry. He would have just kept going. A general of over a decade, let alone Napoleon, whose speciality was from the beginning artillery, would know this. A Hollywood moron would not. Think about it with common sense for one moment. If you are inflicting severe casualties on your enemy while your men are practically safe, why would you change it up? You are already winning the battle. By watering down the battle, that is, by ignoring history and basic tactics, Scott makes the battle simply not make sense. In reality, Wellington cleverly withdrew his infantry to the safety of an opposite side of the ridge of Mont Saint-Jean, where Napoleon's cannonballs could not effectively hit them, rather than just have his men bunker down and take them on the front side of the slope in trenches that didn't exist. And it was precisely this withdrawal that Ney mistook as retreating, leading him to order his fateful cavalry charge. The 1970 Waterloo movie has a moment in which Wellington sees Napoleon through his telescope, riding along his lines to cheer his Grande Armée, and an aide asks for permission to fire cannons at him. Wellington classily responds, "Certainly not. Commanders of armies have something better to do than fire at each other." Scott takes this exact same beat and butchers it by having the request to fire at Napoleon come from a British marksman with a scope on his rifle. Now, I am no specialist in the history and development of firearms, but Wikipedia claims that, quote, the first documented telescope rifle sight was invented between 1835 and 1840, and I trust Wikipedia more than I trust Scott. Further, he has Wellington order the marksman to not take the shot on pain of death. Then he has the marksman take the shot a couple minutes later anyway, still right next to Wellington, but Wellington does nothing about it. It's just silly. Napoleon personally yelling, "Infantry, advance!" is just so stupid. It even literally shows the infantry advancing out of their trench after he says infantry, but before he says advance. But my gosh, look at how beautiful this 1970 shot of the French lines is. And this frame is just a fraction of the whole panning shot, slowly stretching left to right, showing company after company. The British infantry squares, such an important and iconic part of the Battle of Waterloo, look so fake upon a second watch. You can tell that the far-away shots that show 10 infantry squares at a time are CGI, and that the close-ups are so close that we never see more than one full square at a time. And none of the deaths of the soldiers feel like a tragedy because we never see a single face. They feel like drones. Watch Waterloo, on the other hand, and you can see 12 regimental squares in one shot and know that they are each actually filled with over 100 live actors. You can feel the difference if you pay a moment of attention. Waterloo also feels more real because it gives its regular soldiers more character. One Irishman nervously fingers rosary beads as the French draw near. A young officer from atop his horse encourages his men, "Think of your wives, your sweethearts, your homes. Think of England, men! Think of England!" before being shot dead. A bagpiper bravely plays a stirring tune for his fellow Highlanders until he is cut down by a French saber. And finally, one young lad loses his nerve and simply leaves the relative safety of his regimental square, while a comrade cries, "For Jesus' sake, stop him, someone!" and wanders into the field, yelling at the British and French alike, "We've never seen each other. How can we kill one another? How can we? Why do we?" His cries fading away into a panning shot of the whole battlefield. These 2 minutes of unnamed British soldiers have more emotion and insight into the human soul than Scott's entire Waterloo battle, nay, his entire film. When Scott's Napoleon is informed that General Blucher's Prussian army is 5 miles away, he demands that his general leave his tent, broods for a bit, and decides the solution is to send in another wave of infantry by saying, "Infantry, advance!" The impact that this should have is completely missed because Scott leaves out the fact that this was Napoleon's old guard, his most experienced and valuable units, his trump card, the last ace up his sleeve. Then, when that is clearly not working, he decides there's nothing left but to personally lead a cavalry charge. He lines up with his cavalry, says, "Prepare to charge! Charge!" And they go from standing still straight into a charge. You just wouldn't do that. You go through a trot and canter first, gradually gaining speed. Literally, Scott, if you had just watched the Waterloo movie or read the Wikipedia page or any number of documentary videos that work so hard on explaining the battle to those who care, before you made this scene, you could have learned so many things and avoided so many mistakes. Of course, when the two infantry lines meet in the inevitable final bayonet charge melee, it just devolves into the obligatory Hollywood mosh pit. War is hell, but this looks like a circus. The real Waterloo lasted about 8 hours, while in Scott's portrayal, it cannot be imagined to have lasted more than 1. Waterloo gives us a beautiful, tense scene in which both sides' commanders are anxiously watching the approaching Prussian army and trying to guess whether they are French or Prussian, meaning defeat for one side or the other. But in Scott's film, the importance of General Blucher and the Prussian army is a little neglected. There is a cool bit where a British writer goes to find how far away they are, but the dialogue is just so unimaginative and boring. Here's the dialogue. Writer: "Good morning, General Blucher." General Blucher: "Good morning." Writer: "Estimated time of arrival, sir?" Blucher: "Officer?" Prussian officer: "About 5 hours." Blucher to the British writer: "About 5 hours." Brilliant, Mr. Scott. Scott's Wellington is about as charismatic as his Napoleon. Also, in reality, he was 46 years old in 1815, while Scott's Wellington, with his wrinkles and grey hair, looks the 64 years of his actor. We first saw him a couple weeks earlier, before Waterloo, addressing a council of the Alliance, I think at the Congress of Vienna, about how they need to finish Napoleon once and for all. He is the only person at the table to speak, by the way, making it a remarkably boring scene. Then we see him at the dawn of the Battle of Waterloo, sipping tea in his tent, just one servant standing by. Finishing his tea, he says, "I never get wet if I can help it," puts on his hat, and steps into the rain. So, what was the point of that line, of that 30-second scene? Was he speaking to that servant? That could have been so easily a breakfast council scene, where we get to hear the British battle plans. And then, at the end, Wellington says, without an ounce of enthusiasm, "The battle is mine. There will be an end to the war." No depth, no weight, no wit. Compare this to an exchange in the 1970 Waterloo in the morning, shortly before the battle, in which a British general asks Wellington, quote, "Sir, as I am your second in command, and in case anything should happen to you, what are your plans?" And Wellington nonchalantly responds, "To beat the French." When Blucher arrived, there could have been a conversation in which Wellington told him that the battle had been, quote, "a damned near thing, the nearest run thing you ever saw in your life." He also remarked, as he surveyed the thousands of dead littering the field after the battle, that he hoped to God that he fought his last battle. And later he wrote that, quote, "There is nothing so melancholy as a battle won, except for a battle lost," which would have been so moving to see. But no, Scott gives us a smug, "The battle is mine. There will be an end to the war." Again, the 8 minutes that the 2002 miniseries gives to Waterloo is also better. First, Napoleon actually talks to his commanders throughout the battle, with energy and spirit, instead of just giving vague orders to the air, or maybe one faceless officer near him. Scott puts Napoleon in a vacuum, which has the perhaps unintended but inevitable consequence of sucking the life out of him. And second, in one of the most important parts of the battle, it shows Napoleon angry at Ney for leading the cavalry charge without his approval, without infantry support, and against strong infantry unbroken by artillery bombardment, while Scott has Napoleon lead that charge himself. Ney, by the way, had 5 horses killed out from under him throughout the day, and famously shouted before leading a charge, "Come and see how a Marshal of France meets his death." How awesome would that have been? Ironically, Scott manages to both take away credit that belongs to Napoleon and give it to others, and to take away credit that belongs to others and give it to Napoleon. For the final scene of the last 5 years of his life on St. Helena, we could have seen Napoleon sitting or standing on the rocky beach, gazing out at the ocean, like in so many paintings, or dictating his memoirs, which can also be read in full text online, or being given anointing of the sick by a priest. He explicitly indicated in his will that he died within the Catholic faith, or being tended to by doctors as he gradually became sicker with the stomach cancer that ultimately killed him. But what does Scott give us? Napoleon sitting alone in a chair, I think with books, eating what I think are grapes, watching 2 random girls play sword fighting with sticks. He quizzes them. "What is the capital of France?" To which they correctly answer Paris. He presses them. "What is the capital of Russia?" "St. Petersburg, but Moscow before." Then he asks, "Who burned Moscow?" The girls, a little sheepish, answer, "The Russians did, to prevent you from taking it." Napoleon rebukes them, insisting that he burned Moscow, throws a couple grapes at them, I'm not joking here, then shoos them away to resume their play fighting. What the heck was the point of that scene, Mr. Scott? Oh yes, I forgot, to make Napoleon appear pathetic and petty, because that was your intention, neither to tell history nor a good story. Before Scott shows Napoleon die by simply falling over, alone, he had an obnoxious dream sequence of Josephine speaking to Napoleon across the void, inviting him to come to her. This is close to being sweet, if not for her absurd lines, which I cannot fully remember, but I swear include something along the lines of, "Next time, I'll be the emperor." What the heck does that mean, Mr. Scott? Kubrick, on the other hand, had Napoleon describe to the man keeping lonely death watch by his side, quote, the most vivid dream about Josephine, which he had just had, in which she told him they would soon see each other again, never again to part. Then it fades to his tombstone. One of the ending cards of the movie is a list of 5 of the 61 battles that Napoleon fought. Toulon, Marengo, Austerlitz, Borodino, and Waterloo, each giving a number of how many people died in them. A few things dumb about this list. First, the Battle of Marengo is not only not shown in the movie, but the movie explicitly denies its existence because it was one of the battles that Napoleon fought in Italy. Who made the decision to include that battle on the list? Conversely, Scott showed 1 minute of a battle near the pyramids in Egypt, but didn't include the Battle of the Pyramids on his list. Second, a brief reference to Wikipedia, not the most accurate source, but still more accurate than Scott's movie, shows that the numbers the list gives for casualties are way off in some cases, such as claiming that 6,000 died in the Siege of Toulon, when at most 3,000 did, and that 47,000 died in Waterloo, when at most 30,000 did. And third, it specifies, in parentheses, that Waterloo was fought in 1 day. Why? Excuse me, Mr. Scott, are you, or whoever made this little melodramatic closing card, aware that the Battle of Borodino also lasted only 1 day, and that more people died there? So why are you specifying that Waterloo lasted 1 day? I know things like this might seem insignificant, but it is precisely idiotic things like this that add up to show how little the movie makers knew or cared about what they were doing. Closing thoughts. It doesn't matter if you like or dislike Napoleon Bonaparte. See him as a hero or a monster. Both perspectives are valid, but he was a great man. He wouldn't have won and held the heart of France and held the rest of Europe hostage for 15 years if he was not. In 1970's Waterloo, Napoleon asks one of his aides, "When I am dead and gone, what do you think people will say of me?" And the aide responds, "That you extended the limits of glory." And that's true. By depicting Napoleon as immature, insecure, and incompetent, Scott insults not only him, but the rest of France, and indeed, all of Europe. In one of the last scenes of the movie, Napoleon addresses a small cluster of young British midshipmen, one of them black, to remind you that Ridley Scott is inclusive, even if the British aristocracy was not, and they are captivated by him, even though he has been England's sworn enemy for longer than some of them have been alive. The scene is aboard a man-of-war about to take him to St. Helena. While not a historical scene, and therefore inherently of less value than the things Scott chose to not show, this was an opportunity to have some interesting and powerful dialogue to wrap up the story. And Napoleon has some lines that almost do this. He says something along the lines of telling the midshipmen to encourage greatness. And it struck me that the entire movie was doing the opposite of this. Scott takes a man who was great at everything he did, war, politics, romance, and shows him as mediocre in everything. This line, then, which could have been so powerful, rings utterly hollow. In summary, Scott took one of the greatest stories in history and turned it into a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. I conclude my entire review with the great line from the 1995 comedy Billy Madsen, "Mr. Ridley Scott, what you have just said is one of the most insanely idiotic things I have ever heard. At no point in your rambling, incoherent response were you even close to anything that could be considered a rational thought. Everyone in this room is now dumber for having listened to you. I award you no points, and may God have mercy on your soul." And so I close, my dear listener. I implore you to not patronize this movie by purchasing a ticket. Rather, I sincerely and earnestly invite you to watch the 1970 Waterloo, or the 2002 Napoleon miniseries, or to read the Stanley Kubrick script. You would both learn more history and experience better stories than you would by watching Scott's Napoleon. I thank you for listening to my thoughts, and I hope to remain your humble and obedient servant, Dominic.Dybala.